you might see Western forces entering Ukraine in some kind of tripwire force, although they need to take risk to do that. And of course, the whole aim of Putin going into Ukraine in the first place was to reduce Western influence. It was to put it firmly back into Russia's sphere of influence. I mean, the fact, here I am sort of slightly meandering through these different explanations. The fact that the outcomes are so messy at the moment and so costly for both sides are a kind of indicator of the risk of there simply being a pause and a return to fighting in several years, because no one's going to be wholly satisfied with it. Even if the Russians do get to hold a reasonable chunk, 18 to 20% of Ukraine, that's not a great trade for what might be, by the end of this year, 1 million casualties. The people who understand how this works have highlighted a number of pressures in the Russian economy, and they are hugely dependent on energy for revenue, but they have reduced their dependence over the past few years after the initial impact of sanctions has also been factored in. And by that I mean the internal Russian economy has helped soften the blow that has been created by sanctions. There's also a degree of sanctions evasion going on, but there's been more internal employment. So Russian unemployment has dropped as they've attempted to sort of create more revenue from internal Russian financial activity, economic activity. And so my understanding is that actually the revenue from energy export has dropped as a percentage because the rest of the economy has done some compensation. And that's how the Russian economy was able to continue growing after that initial round of sanctions and further sanctions were levied. Of course, what many experts will point out is that many of the sanctions have basically been evaded, and so their impact has been diminished, but that means there's scope to do more. I think overall the Russian economy looks pretty creaky, but the question is it resilient enough to last for the duration that Putin needs it to achieve some of the military objectives that he's after?
Well, and on that note, I mean, it was interesting Donald Trump coming out last week and saying if Putin does not end the war, he will impose new taxes, new tariffs, and new sanctions on Russia. Now, what exactly those sanctions might be, because sanctions have been imposed already, but whether you could go after the shadow fleet in a more effective way, who knows? What do you make of those comments? I mean, it maybe is a bolder stance against Russia than we have been used to from Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think it's no surprise that Trump did, in fact, not end the war in his first 24 hours. And I think everyone understood that was always hyperbole. I also think there are some concerns in the approach that he might take. But at the same time, it's not been as bad as it could have been. And I think that's in part because the Ukrainians did everything that they could to try and pitch themselves as the reasonable party in any forthcoming negotiations. So they said they were ready to talk. They've tried to remain active on the battlefield. They've done an awful lot of positive messaging at the US and at Trump as a, if you like, winner. And that means they've tried to put the onus on Putin as being the one who will be unreasonable. So I think they've given themselves a reasonable chance of influencing Trump's position, and him coming out with that strong statement, putting a lot of the responsibility on Putin and the Russians to negotiate, would be exactly the sort of thing they're looking for. I think there are two caveats on it, though. The first is that it's not clear how much additional sanctions would actually, or tariffs would actually matter. That requires there to be direct trade with the US, not a huge amount, and also lots of people who are currently trading with Russia who would suddenly stop. And I think, the things that if you say the Chinese, the Iranians, other people do to trade in or evade sanctions suggests that they're not going to be inclined to change their minds for now. But it does mean that there might be scope for a more muscular enforcement of those sanctions, going after the shadow fleet. So things that are already in place, making sure they're actually done. The other caveat is that the battlefield situation where the front line is and the balance at the moment isn't particularly favourable towards the Ukrainians. We could talk a bit about some of the military challenges they're facing. But what that means is time is not on their side, and they need quite a lot of it to redress that balance. Otherwise, the negotiations will just result in a pretty dismal outcome for them, which is them having to settle for having a reasonable chunk of their country out of their control and not much prospect of turning the tide, or rather getting it back. And that's where things slightly favour Putin if he thinks he can eke out military activity for the rest of 2025, because what he could do is play for time or enter into negotiations, but do so essentially disingenuously and move slowly, grinding his way forward until such a time as then there is a pause called, whereupon it will suit him. That will have been done at enormous cost. By no means would that be victory for Russia, but it would have inflicted enough damage on Ukraine and put them in an unfavorable position from which to try and, they're going to have to think years forward about how might they regain their territory, how might they outflank the Russians. So there's an awful lot of that could still happen to influence the very long term. And I think a lot of people are sceptical that any cessation of violence this year would be a permanent cessation. But the challenge is that getting the Ukrainians into a good position this year is going to require patience and discipline. And neither of those are things that Donald Trump has shown that he has in abundance.
There was a piece over the weekend in the Times by our special correspondent, Anthony Lloyd, going through sort of 4 scenarios of how this war could end. I'll just put them to you briefly, Matthew, and get your take on them. Number 1, it was the idea that Ukraine is just completely militarily defeated. If Trump, for example, decides, you know what, no more military aid, I'm pulling the rug from underneath your feet. Number 2 is some kind of bad deal for Ukraine, whereby they're forced to sue for peace from a position of weakness, and essentially a kind of a Quisling government is installed in Kyiv. Number 3, a ceasefire, but of course that's how long does that last, and does that lead to something more permanent? And number 4, a negotiated settlement, which of the 4 options appears most favourable to Ukraine, but it depends on what the terms are, and it probably involves some territorial concessions in exchange for security guarantees. Of those options, Matthew, what at the moment appears the most feasible?
I think at the moment what we're looking at is some kind of negotiated settlement, but not on particularly favourable terms. There's a bit of a blurring of the lines between that and a ceasefire, because what you might find is something that's not a permanent, neither a ceasefire nor what the Ukrainians would want for a negotiated settlement would be final, I think, at the moment. I don't see the Ukrainians being defeated in the way that you're describing in terms of a complete collapse at the moment, not least because the Russians don't quite have the ability to have these sort of massive breakthroughs that would suddenly result in the unraveling of the whole Ukrainian position. But they can certainly force the Ukrainians back in ways that are unpleasant for them, in terms of losing much more territory, particularly in the Donbass. I do think there's still scope, for example, of the trading in of the territory that they're holding inside Kursk, but that's value has diminished as they've taken.
And what would you get in exchange for that, do you think?
Well, good question. I mean, the most obvious answer is you would effectively trade it for the conflict that's happening next to it, which is the Kharkiv lodgement. The Russians haven't done particularly well there, but they are just over the border threatening Kharkiv. You could maybe see a direct swap for it. I'm not sure if that's what the Ukrainians would want to do, but they're holding about 45% of what they held in August last year, and they've lost a lot of people and equipment to get that lodgement. So I think that the problem is that it's still worth something, but probably not what they were hoping 6 months ago, 5 months ago, I would say. So I think the real issue is, where does the front line end up? And what does that look like in terms of future ambitions? As I say, that there is a problem that for the Russians it wouldn't be job done. You and indeed, depending on what a post-ceasefire settlement looks like, you might see Western forces entering Ukraine in some kind of tripwire force, although they need to take risk to do that. And of course, the whole aim of Putin going into Ukraine in the first place was to reduce Western influence. It was to put it firmly back into Russia's sphere of influence. I mean, the fact, here I am sort of slightly meandering through these different explanations. The fact that the outcomes are so messy at the moment and so costly for both sides are a kind of indicator of the risk of there simply being a pause and a return to fighting in several years, because no one's going to be wholly satisfied with it. Even if the Russians do get to hold a reasonable chunk, 18 to 20% of Ukraine, that's not a great trade for what might be, by the end of this year, 1 million casualties.
And if there were Western troops in Ukraine enforcing some kind of demilitarized zone or under some kind of security arrangement, who knows, would that include US troops?
I think the first thing is that we don't really know what's on the table here, because a lot of this discussion is sort of being filtered through speculation. I find it hard to believe that you would have a classic peacekeeping force, because peacekeeping forces of the kind that, are supported by the UN are fundamentally neutral forces. We're very much not neutral in this conflict. Then you've got a question of are they there to train? Are they there as a kind of presence that would be a tripwire that would pull in other allies? I think it's difficult to see a US commitment at the moment, given the way that Trump continues to talk about the use of forces. And that's the bit of what he said in the past week that is difficult for the Ukrainians, which is that he looks very much not committed to further conflict. Obviously for some people that's really good news that the US is talking in less interventionist terms, but it means the Europeans are going to have to stump up for European security, and not before time, many would say.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.